Thank you for your cooperation. I know that this morning and yesterday have been so rich that it's very natural for many conversations to be bubbling up, and so it's a little hard to cut them off and reconvene. But I do really think this panel will be dessert. This panel is Harnessing Private Enterprise to Public Policy Goals. But in the conversation with the panelists as we were approaching it, I think I might reframe it slightly and call it Partnerships Producing Equitable Economic Development. And as you hear from our three speakers, mull that over and think about whether you wouldn't agree that the contributions they are each and together making, because what we have up here in this trio are partnerships that bring them all together. Think about whether these kinds of partnerships are not what it's going to take across sectors, across types of organizations that will create equitable economic development. So bear that question in mind as we proceed. To introduce you to the panelists, we have first, and this is in the order in which they will speak, Ashok Khosla, who is President of Development Alternatives, which I would now term, after a speech last week at the Skoll Forum, I'll call it not a nonprofit, but a social profit organization. And indeed, this one generates a good deal of social profit. He is also Chair and CEO of TERRA, Technology in Action for Rural Advancement. And Ashok has been an advisor across a wide range of organizations that do cross sectors: the United Nations, the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the MacArthur Foundation, and I've been very selective in that highlighting, so that you know here he's bringing a frame of reference which is indeed broad-gauged. And he is also partnering with Shell, so we have here a kind of a trilogy that we'll hear about as they expand. Next, Kurt Hoffman, seated next to him, is director of the Shell Foundation. He joined Shell now about a decade ago. It'll be a decade ago next year, I think, where he initially was brought in to help evaluate and restructure Shell's global social investment strategy. And in June of 2000, Shell launched an International Shell Foundation. Since then, they have undertaken a quite wide array, I think it's over 80 initiatives in some 20 countries or so in which Shell operates. And in January '06, I'd like to call your attention to this because I know we won't have time to go as much into this as today. They published a paper called Investing for Impact, Managing and Measuring Proactive Social Investments, that was commissioned and by the Foundation and was written and produced by the Foundation Strategy Group. I think this is a very provocative report, and I want to underscore it and call your attention to it and thank Shell for having underwritten this study. Now, much attention's been focused on Shell's work with small enterprise support and development, and Kurt has talked about that in other fora. So today, I understand he's going to focus on a somewhat less well-documented experience that Shell has had working in the transportation sector in Mexico, and he will be our second speaker. In conclusion, Alan Detheridge, who's Vice President, Exploration and Production, External Affairs for Shell, who I think has been with Shell about 30 years, as I calculated from the biography, came into it from the computing industry, and his portfolio at Shell involves work across governments, citizen sector organizations, foundations, multilateral organizations. He's had a particular focus on Africa, and he's launched a number of very interesting partnerships that I think it's fair to say, as recently as 10 years ago, were quite uncommon to see these kinds of partnerships that cross sectors as well as organizations. He's also on the board of Synergos, which many of us in the Global Philanthropy Forum are well familiar, and I think, therefore, has partnered in a variety of ways. And I'm asking today to draw on Shell's experience, but to talk a little more broadly about partnerships across corporations, even beyond Shell. And finally, I'd say your moderator. I am the Executive Vice President of ShoreBank Corporation, which is a hybrid maybe between the citizen sector space and the financial return maximizing corporation, in that we are a bank holding company whose shareholders invested to use the financial institution for community economic development. And we work domestically and internationally. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to kick this off. Ashok is going to be our first speaker. And I might kick us off with a quote that is drawn from the Shell report I just cited that struck me. And this is, "Social investment defies the absolute separation between investments and grants that's deeply embedded in the thinking, skills, incentives, and organizational structures of philanthropy. I think one of the exciting things about being part of the Global Philanthropy Forum is that all of us here are exploring how we can use all of the instruments of grant making, of investment, of guarantees, of loan funds, and of partnerships to accelerate and increase the impact on all of the issues that we're addressing. So I'd like to invite Ashok to start us off.
Thank you, Jan. I am myself in my organization actually a bit of a hybrid. My organization has raised over the last 20-odd years about $100 million. It has also given away on behalf of the British government, the aid agency of the British government, Detheridge, something like $60 million. So I'm partly a donor and partly a recipient of philanthropic money, which gives me a little different insight into some of the things that I think we need to share. Because I am from the third world, Jan has given me a little extra time because I need to share with you some rather complex ideas, and I thought it would be useful to take you through what I give my colleagues, which is Philanthropy 101, to begin with, and then try to build on that, because if we don't have a common language, it would be a bit difficult for us to go through what I'm trying to share with you. Well, first of all, when we talk about private enterprise, we usually think of the giants. Private enterprise, big, multinationals, large, maybe medium-sized companies, but they're usually private because they're big. Actually, my own work shows that it is the small and the mini and even the micro that really are going to make the big difference in terms of bringing society onto the track that we have to bring it to. So what is the taxonomy of corporate purpose? Companies do well by doing well. That's why they're called corporations. They do good by doing well, and that's sort of part of what we've been talking about here all last couple of days. Philanthropy is done usually by foundations, even by corporations. Then you can do good by doing good. That's things like churches and voluntary organizations and some NGOs. And then there's what we're talking about here, which is to do well by doing good. In other words, your products and services are actually social good. And if you look at the ladder to corporate heaven, you basically have people doing their thing, their PR, they're telling everybody how good they are, they make a little bit of a donation here for a water pump or whatever. They go up that ladder by being compliant with the laws of the land, which is very, very important, but frankly, it's no great contribution. I mean, just to be a legal person isn't really something you have to write home about. Then you can go beyond compliance, doing things that are not required but are good. And beyond that, I think, is philanthropy, taking your money after paying taxes and using it for varieties of purposes. But I think there's one step beyond that, and that is social enterprise. That is when your very business, the core of business, is social goods and services. So this is the ladder that I think we've got to think of. Philanthropy is terrific, but there's even a step beyond that, when companies actually say, we want to stand and be counted in terms of what we actually do. So on the side, you've got private profit. On this side, you've got societal impact. And the latter takes you more and more towards the balance, towards doing good for society. We call these things in the middle CSR, we call the things on the right beyond CSR. But one of our famous management gurus once said, the social responsibility of a company is to make money. And you know, I think that's right. I think that is basically what a company is supposed to do and should do. But he also said that every business professional should take the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. So there's a constraint around making money. It's how you make money and what you make money on that counts as much as the act of actually doing so. So now we're talking this afternoon about promoting philanthropy. There are lots of different ways to do that. You can rely on the market, you could rely on government setting rules and regulations, and everything in between, including fiscal incentives and so on, tax structures. Today's market mechanisms really are not geared to promoting either philanthropy or social enterprise, partly because of the fact that capital is the root of all your thinking about business, and partly because the rights of other stakeholders are not embedded in the legal systems. And the corporation, the corporate world, is allowed to not only respond to the consumer is king, is what they say, but actually to mold the king, mold the views of the king. So now, if we're going to be talking about sustainable development, and the philanthropic world, in fact, wants to do that, then you've got to bring together the economic with the social and the environmental. And there are lots of things that get in there. This, of course, every one of you knows, this is the cover page of the Human Development Report of the United Nations, and it's the income distribution. I call it the champagne glass theory of life. This is how basically we have constructed our economies. The top 20% hijack something like 80 or 90% of the income of the world. But the people that we philanthropists have to deal with are at the bottom end. They're in the stem. That's the 60-odd% who manage to garner just about 5% of the... And that gap, incidentally, is growing. And not only is the gap between the rich and the poor growing, I was with an economist a little while ago, and he was telling me, you know, the data show that the rich are getting richer, but then the poor are getting poorer, so it all averages out in the end. So we basically have a mindset that we've got to deal with, and philanthropy has to also look at some of the root causes, things like resources, climate change, disease, biodiversity loss, desertification, peak oil or rise of price of oil, and indeed the ecological footprint, the amount of the earth that we're using up as individuals or societies. Today, according to the World Wildlife Fund, we're using up 1.2 times the capacity of the earth. Right now, we're drawing down on the capital that nature has provided us. So this income distribution doesn't work. We've got to find somewhere else. And the funny thing is that we're asking the very people who are partly responsible for that, the private sector, the corporate world, to help change the mindsets of the consumer to do the opposite. So it's not going to be easy. We're really, in a sense, attacking a fundamental contradiction when we say that philanthropy ought to help. And when Tim Wirth was talking yesterday, I was really struck by how powerful a statement he was making about the role of philanthropy in mobilizing civil society, in mobilizing people, and how enormous a contradiction that actually implies internally within that argument. And we've, at the moment, got no choice but to play on that contradiction. So what can we expect from corporations? Or better still, can corporate decision-making really handle the issues of sustainable development? I think that's a legitimate question for us to ask. Are we really playing with here a fire that cannot be put out? In other words, we've started a whole train of civilization, and it's essentially going to... Corporations, they believe they're the masters of the universe. They're creating all kinds of beautiful things out there, and in the process, this little old woman from Madras in South India is essentially completely ruined her field with salinization. And you know, our whole systems of farming are geared actually to nonsense. Many of the vegetables we buy in the supermarkets actually contain 500 calories of energy for 1 calorie of food energy that you eat. That's kind of, you know, is that basically what we're going to have to put up with? Because in essence, these are all dead-end strategies. Now, I believe that we've got to leapfrog into a whole different world. I don't think that the way we're living today is, it's not my thinking. There's evidence to prove that we just cannot afford to use materials and energy and water and everything else at the rate that we're doing. And we'll have to adapt market institutions to deal with the transition so that we look at the market as our friend. And the market can really be only our friend if we can figure out different ways to produce and consume. We need very fundamental changes now in lifestyles and consumption patterns. I'm not going to go into them because most of you here, because you know and are concerned about them. But certainly the material consumption of our civilization has to be brought down by at least a factor of 4, if not 10, to bring it in line with the constraints of nature. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through the remaining few slides. This is the work that I do in the field. This is the headquarters where my organization is domiciled. In the back you see Nehru University, the National University of India, made entirely out of steel and cement and concrete. My building over here has no steel, no cement, no wood, and no bricks. It's made entirely out of mud and lime plaster. It's symbolic of the kinds of things that we believe that a good half of the world has to go to right now, and probably within a few decades, we're going to have to see other ways to do things. Jan talked about our project with Shell. This is part of that project. Shell has supported us generously to Shell Foundation to bring better cook stoves into the lives of Indian village women. And it's, I think, one of the most amazingly useful things to do because today, cooking environment in the village is basically reducing a woman's life by at least 20 years, if not more, from the carcinogens she breathes, and plus the 3 or 4 hours she spends collecting fuel wood, and these stoves really basically address some of those issues. We've developed whole ranges of technologies for construction using mud. This is the National Exhibition Center of India, made out of mud. We've developed whole ranges of other technologies. Now, this is not philanthropy, but it's social enterprise. It's making things that people need in a manner that gives you profit so you can grow, but in a manner that they can afford at the lowest salaries. Handlooms, handmade recycled paper, using weeds, prolific growing weeds, converting them into electricity in local power stations by gasifying them, making all kinds of new agricultural and systems of production which are much more benign. Small dams, instead of that big one I showed you, which can have huge dramatic impacts. I have been asked to stop. I just want to tell you, I'm going to take one more minute, Chair. The return on investment on that dam, this dam, by the way, was paid for by Sir Tony Greener, who was then the chairman of United Distilleries, the people who make Johnny Walker whiskey, and later became the chairman of Diageo, the biggest food company in the world. And it was paid for PR. He wanted to open a distillery in India and show that he was a good businessman and concerned about the poor. So he gave us money to make 5 of these dams, which we did. Now, the return on investment in terms of social return, the return to the individual farmers and women and everybody else around, was of the order of 10,000%. I mean, we're talking about massively different economics from what you get in modern industry. Internet-based marketing systems to get things out in the market. Okay, we've got to change our footprints. We've got to change our impact. And here we're talking about finance. In this group, our biggest problem is finance, and I have to tell you, it's my biggest bottleneck too. That's why it's first, F. F for finance. It keeps getting in the way of everything I try to do, lack of it. But because we are concerned about finance, we often forget there are other equally important things like technology, like marketing systems, like delivery systems, like the institutional frameworks within which we have to operate, and then, of course, the policies and so on. So I do want to remind us that while we are sitting on one key, what you might call bottleneck or resource, which can help us take things forward, we have to think about all the other things that finance enables us to do, which often we don't. And we often take very easy ways out simply by putting money in there without thinking through what are the more systemic root cause issues and how do we basically build them up. My own feeling is that the society of 10 decades, of our children, certainly our grandchildren, is not going to follow the champagne glass theory. It's going to be more like a glass of beer or water or whatever else. So here is the future, an ecological footprint where we can sustain ourselves, where the world will not have to go on adding more worlds. By the year 2030, at present, business as usual paths of development, that's what you're going to have to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a provocative beginning, and I'm sure there's a lot of points others will want to draw out when we get to questions. Let me turn directly to Kurt.
It's on, right, okay. Thank you, Jan. Afternoon, everyone. I was watching very carefully while Ashok was talking. I shouldn't have worried Ashok being the speaker, but I was going to offer him that if I had noticed any heads nodding in the audience, I was going to tell him when he sat down not to worry, they were all agreeing with him.
You weren't going to sleep?
So you did well, Ashok. You also made a number of connections between your topic and what I want to talk about, which is a different angle on the role of business and business partnerships, but tackling issues of sustainability. Ashok talked a lot about the CSR dimension of the role of business and the challenges for business to do no harm, and those are legitimate concerns. The Shell Foundation spends a lot of time trying to think about how, in a sense, to go beyond the CSR model and look, in a sense, deeper into businesses and try to find the skills and the tools and the techniques that have made the business model of business, of course, a very successful one for generating wealth and income, and try to see if there are inside business skills and techniques that can be applied to the challenges of development and the environment in order to affect the sort of changes that we do. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think it hopefully adds a little slightly different dimension to the role of business. Business and policy, which was the original title of the topic, also want to touch on a little bit, because often when we think about business engaging with public policy, it's about lobbying, right? Which civil society calls campaigning, which is the same thing. And lobbying in this town, I guess, has a pretty mixed history, I guess. But I think that we've seen often some successes on lobbying and campaigning, but often in areas where there's really complex issues and where politicians and policymakers have to take really difficult choices. Lobbying often isn't so successful. And we've seen that in the environmental area, particularly in the process leading to the Kyoto Protocol, where there was an awful lot of lobbying going on by all sorts of players, and the lobbying had some impact, negative and positive, but it really didn't lead the policymakers to take any decisions that have seem to be leading us to anywhere that we want to be in terms of the future. So I want to talk about a different way of business engaging with the policy and using business skills to tackle these complex issues. And it's about a challenge that hasn't been talked about much here. It's about how you get developing country cities to introduce sustainable transport policies. Now, I bet that's going to start people nodding. But, we've spent a lot of time and energy talking about the rural poor and how difficult the conditions are and how, well, that's true, but by 2030, the date that Ashok mentioned, nearly 5 billion people will be living in cities. Many of those will be in cities in developing countries. I don't know whether that'll be 5 out of every 7 people. It's already 1 out of every 2 people living in a city, and by 2030, so 5 out of every 7. That's a big problem, right? It's a big sustainable problem, because it means that developing country cities and the populations and the way they consume resources are going to define not only their quality of life, but the quality of life in sort of global terms for the rest of us. So cities is a big issue. Why should sustainable transport be an issue for these cities? Well, two reasons. First of all, city dwellers in developing countries, like city dwellers in most cities, I think, spend most of their daily commuting time stuck in traffic, either in cars if you're rich, or in dysfunctional mass transit systems if you're poor, where you're inhaling horrible fumes and it's unsafe and it's dirty and it takes hours to get around. So, and you all share that experience, I'm sure. So you're stuck in traffic. And when transport systems in developing country cities don't work, it has a huge equity impact, because it means transport as a sort of facilitator of dynamic economic development, which is what happened when rich country cities were developing, doesn't play that role in developing country cities. And most of the people who suffer are the poor, because they're the ones that are stuck in traffic and they have to live way outside and take these horrible buses and so on. So first reason is that it has an equity impact when there's traffic jams in developing country cities. Secondly, from a global perspective, to get to the environmental issues, all this traffic contributes to climate change. The transport sector in general already accounts for about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's growing at nearly 3% a year. And much of that growth, again, if you look at the profile, will take place in future in developing country cities. So if you're worried about the planet, you're worried about climate change, you're worried about equity, and you're worried about getting from your job to your home in time, you have to worry about transport in cities and in developing country cities. The challenge is even worse in a sense when you talk about policy, is that because influencing city transport policies is very complicated, it's a lot of politics, a lot of conflict, there's a lot of money involved in building roads and bridges, and money attracts all sorts of problems. When big transport projects in cities are undertaken, it affects a lot of people, so there's a lot of protests and demonstrations and so on. So, you can't disentangle politics from policy, from tackling environment and sustainability issues. You can't disentangle it. And that's why in developing country cities, and I guess many rich country cities, so few good transport policies are put in place, because it's just too bloody difficult. The politicians don't want to know. I'll just put it off. We'll anger an influential class or something. We just won't do it. And so things get worse. But of course, we can't let things getting worse, because there's so many people and so many cars and so many resources involved. This is not a situation that we can allow. Something has to happen. You have to figure out how to influence transport policy in developing country cities to become more sustainable. That's the challenge, and the challenge is, how do you do it? Well, Shell Foundation has two objectives. We focus on poverty issues and how to bring enterprise solutions to tackling poverty. We also focus on environmental issues, where we have a big objective to reduce the environmental impacts of fossil fuel use coming from the Shell Foundation, right? It's endorsed by the group. So that's the objective that we have, and we have in mind as we try to figure out what first to do in the environment, where we would focus, and we learned about transport and about the role of cities, and so we decided that we couldn't go about tackling this issue in the way we've done in other places where you do a lot of individual one-off projects. We needed a mature, robust partner who could engage with the cities and bring the challenges of getting policy change to the city. So we created EMBARK, which is the Center for Sustainable Transport and Environment at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. And then we set about trying to adapt the principles of business partnerships to grappling with this complex policy problem that I described as cities and transport policies. So we developed a business model, really, a model of intervention. Partners were important, and stakeholders had to be engaged, but you only wanted partners involved who had a vested interest in the outcome. You couldn't be there just because you were worried about it. You had to be part of the partnership because you had a vested interest in the outcome, and you could add real value to the partnership. The partnership had to have, in going into the city, specific purpose, measurable outcomes. There had to be shared risk and reward. We had to find partners who were willing to put money and resources and reputations and jobs at risk at the same time. and the partnerships had to deliver profitable as well as environmentally sustainable solutions, because without the two, you're not going to get them. And finally, the tricky one was we had to put governments as a partner, but we also had to put them in control, because they take the decisions, right? The city governments are those who take the decisions. So we had to find a way to put them in control. So we adapted this model first in Mexico City, where we had our first, Embark had its first partnership in Mexico City, where we incorporated these sort of political variables into our market entry strategy. And we have been there for 3 years, and I want to talk a little bit about the results and the model that led, and I will meet the minute target, right? In Embark, we formed a legal partnership with the city, so there was a contractual obligation. Secondly, we used local experts and who knew the local problems and local stakeholders had to be engaged. Thirdly, WRI brought its credibility to convince the Mexico City government to get involved with the private sector, which was Shell and the Shell Foundation. We used Shell Mexico to bring other private partners to the table. So you see a little bit of the use of the Shell assets and skills there. And WRI Embark parlayed $1 million of our money into about $6 million of planning. 2 projects were undertaken. One was the bus rapid transit, which is what I'm going to talk about. It's bus rapid transit systems are above ground undergrounds. What were the results of this partnership focused on introducing bus rapid transit systems in Mexico City? Well, it's up and running after 2 years of planning. Metrobus is the name of the company. It's running along Avenidas Insurgentes, which is a beautiful avenue in Mexico City, 20 kilometers or more, all stuck in traffic. But the bus corridor now runs on 2 dedicated lanes. 250,000 people daily use the bus corridor now. They travel up and down in 80 new buses. It's just had its 50 millionth passenger in under a year. North-south travel time has been cut in half, but if you are conservative on that and say if you assume only a 10-minute saving and you value it at 2 cents per minute, it generates about 12.5 million in savings a year, so which means full payback in under 5 years, because the total capital cost was about 60 million. On the environmental side, that one line out of 32 will cut 47,000 tons a year of CO2 out of the climate and passenger exposure, and I have to read this because it's too technical, to conventional air pollution has been dramatically reduced. There's been 50% reduction in exposure to benzene, which is a known carcinogen, 35% reduction in PM 2.5, and almost 50% reduction in CO2. Now, most of the passengers are poor people, okay? So it has a huge social and equity effect in there. So in the partnership, we worked with the city as partners. We brought business skills. We used project management techniques, a whole variety of project management techniques we brought from Shell into the partnership to help it work. And we managed to move this, with other partners, move this cumbersome, very difficult entity, Mexico City government, to put this Metrobus project in line. So it just gives you a sense of, when it comes to these complex issues, business has, in addition to lobbying, in addition to behaving properly, it has a set of skills to bring to bear in this area that I think are worth note and worthwhile seeking out as a partnership to affect change elsewhere. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And you were noting that you did that with WRI as well. So partnership there too.
We are Embark and Shell Foundation.
Let's turn now to Alan.
Now for something different, yet somebody else from talking to you from Shell. I come from the sharp end of the business at Shell, exploration and production. That's getting oil and gas out of the ground, discovering it first of all, getting it out of the ground, and taking it to market. What I wanted to talk to you about is why people in my business also interest themselves in public policy goals. Why the work of the Shell Foundation is clearly important, and it informs a lot of us in the rest of the business. It challenges us and so on. But we don't leave all of those interventions solely to the Shell Foundation. We are concerned as well. I guess the first question is, why should people in the exploration and production business, or any business for that matter, concern themselves with public policy goals, trying to help fix some of the difficult problems in the world that Ashok talked to us about that. Why are we interested in poverty and equity, in HIV/AIDS, all of those kinds of things? Now, the answer may be self-evidently clear to you people in this room, and it's clear actually to quite a large number of businesses, some of whom are also represented in this room. But it's not necessarily clear to all businesses. And the answer really lies in the fact that our business models, the way in which we think about our businesses, the way in which we make money, all ultimately depend on what happens in society. Put bluntly, in my terms, you can't expect to continue to produce oil or gas in a country over the long haul if during that time people are getting poorer, they're not becoming healthier, their health is getting worse, if equity just plummets in that situation, and if things just continue to get worse. If society worries about climate change, you cannot afford to ignore that issue. You have to get involved in the debate. You have to see what you can do. You need to concern yourself about HIV/AIDS, not only because of the impact that that's going to have on your staff and the people who work with you, your contractors, but also what it's going to do to countries, because countries are your markets. So there are plenty of reasons why forward-thinking companies need to concern themselves with public policy issues, and indeed they may well be willing to do so. But the second question is, well, why should people like you, philanthropists and social entrepreneurs, reach out to them, include them in your network, spare them the time of day, if you like? And I'd like to talk just briefly about some of those issues. I think the first reason for engaging companies is, frankly, because we think differently. We've had a whole set of different experiences in our lives, certainly to civil society actors, and maybe to others as well. We have a different perspective. We sometimes come up with different ideas. Sometimes those are dumb ideas, but nevertheless they're ideas. And we can offer up a different approach. Let me just give you one example of that. A few years ago, I was invited to dinner in New York, and I sat next to a very pleasant Belgian gentleman. Around the table were some luminaries. Coretta Scott King was there, and Mrs. Annan, Kofi Annan's wife. The whole of the table wanted to talk to Coretta Scott King and Kofi Annan, so myself and the Belgian gentleman entertained ourselves. Turns out he was the head of UNAIDS, Dr. Peter Piot. So I asked him what were some of his biggest problems that he had. And he rattled off a catalogue of problems to do with his forecasts of the incidence of HIV/AIDS, which are wrong by large factors when you measure them over time, sometimes too much, sometimes too little. And we talked about that. And he said, but my main problem is getting a consensus around what should we do to tackle the scourge of HIV/AIDS. A consensus between activists, between developing country governments, certainly with corporations, many of whom don't enter into the dialogue, and with other actors. And as we talked, it became clear to me that really the way that dialogue was going, it was a dialogue really not looking forward, but looking back. It was working on a model of, if you only did what I'm telling you to do, we wouldn't be in this mess today. And we didn't just have one set of those interactions, you had multiple interactions. And the suggestion I made to him was, look, instead of looking back, why don't we look forward? Because people find it so much easier to think about the future, about various possible futures. They can agree that if this happened and that happened, then that very well might turn out to be the case. So we worked together and got in one room on a number of occasions, a total of about 500 people, went through a dialogue and process of developing some future-looking scenarios as to what might happen as a result of HIV/AIDS in Africa over the next 22 to 50 years. And the interesting thing about that is if you look to the future, as I say, people can agree on that, but then the trick is to say, well, look, if those are the possible futures, then what should we collectively, not just you, but what should we be doing today? And that dialogue has led to an entire process which has led to the production of a report which goes to the next UN General Assembly on universal access to HIV/AIDS treatment and care. Now, I tell you that story not to say how clever we are in Shell, but just to represent the fact that just by coming with a different perspective, you can help somebody deal with a problem. So the first reason is we think differently. Secondly, we can be an advocate. Now that may sound a bit strange. Who the heck would want Shell advocating on their side? And it doesn't work in all kinds of circumstances. But I was telling the story this morning of something called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. That's an initiative which got together civil society groups, businesses, extractive industry businesses, to agree on something very fundamental, that there ought to be transparency about revenues flowing to governments in that industry, particularly in parts of the world where that industry is the predominant industry. And why I tell you about that story is because it was a very powerful move to have Shell and BP and Rio Tinto Zinc go hand in hand with Oxfam, Save the Children Fund, Global Witness, to the British government and say, we all agree on something. We disagree about a lot of things, but we all agree on this, and we think you should back it, which indeed Tony Blair did, and EITI is now alive and well and active in 20 countries. I just want to start to conclude by putting another proposition on the table, which is essentially some of the big challenges that we have today are so complex that no single actor on their own can solve them. Certainly not at the global level, probably not at the national level, and sometimes even not at the local level. And that old model of me telling you what to do, it may be relevant in some cases. It may still indeed even be necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need new approaches that enable diverse actors to work together, as I think Kurt and Ashok were saying. And I guess I would also say that I think there is a role for the philanthropic world in that scenario. Not only, I think, about providing money. I think there is a convening role, an encouraging role that philanthropists can play. There are some examples of that, and I've given those examples earlier today. The work of the Synergos Institute in a number of groundbreaking projects associated with Generon, trying to deal with child nutrition in India, for just to take one example. Convening people together who usually argue amongst each other, getting them to agree on common goals, getting them to work together to actually do something and make a difference, takes a lot of hard work. I've been involved with a number of these projects, and I've still got the stripes on my back. It takes vision, it takes energy, and it takes commitment. But somebody's got to do it, because if we don't do that, if we don't work together, then nothing much is going to change. And as Ashok says, the world is just not going to be a sustainable place. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you.